San Diegans accomplish great things every day. We care about our neighbors and our community. We are proud of our diversity. We are resilient. We hold our leaders accountable. We live in one of the most dynamic cities in America, the San Diego Union-Tribune, telling San Diego's story for more than 150 years.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gail F. Baker, Vice President and Provost at the University of San Diego.
And I'm Dr. Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USD.
For the second year in a row, USD, along with its College of Arts and Sciences and Humanities Center, is proud to return as the presenting sponsor for the 2021 San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books.
As a university deeply committed to the liberal arts, USD promotes a form of lifelong learning that ignites curiosity, builds critical connections across different ideas and topics by seeing them from unique perspectives.
Our partnership with the Festival of Books enables all of us avid readers to come together as a community alongside renowned authors from all over the world and to dive deeply into imaginative stories and important themes.
Yes, books do have the ability to open minds and hearts. On behalf of the University of San Diego, we thank you for joining us for today's program to explore the world of books with us.
Enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the San Diego Union-Tribune's Festival of Books. I'm Abby Hamblin, an editor here at the UT, and I'm excited to be hosting a panel with such an amazing group of best-selling authors. Let me introduce them to you, and then we'll get started. We have Carol Edgarian. She's an author, editor, and publisher known for novels including Rise of the Euphrates and 3 Stages of Amazement. She's also co-founder, editor, and publisher of Narrative Magazine. She's based in San Francisco, and today we'll be talking about her latest book, Vera. It's a story of personal growth and adventure starring a character with the same title of the book, Vera. And it's set at the time of the devastating earthquake and fires in San Francisco in 1906. We also have Michelle Gable, who you may know from A Paris Apartment, I'll See You in Paris, The Book of Summer, and The Summer I Met Jack. She's based in San Diego, and her latest book is coming out next month, and we'll be talking about that here. It's called The Bookkeeper's Secret. It jumps back and forth between modern day and England in the 1940s and the lives of 2 women who are uniquely interesting and are also authors themselves. And then we have Kate Quinn, described as a lifelong history buff who has written novels in the Empress of Rome saga and the Italian Renaissance, in addition to 20th century stories. She also lives in California, and we'll be talking about her latest, The Rose Code, today. It's set during World War II and shares the stories of 3 women codebreakers at the famous Bletchley Park. So awesome to have 3 Californian authors for the San Diego Festival of Books. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us. This is great fun.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to have you all here. So since you all have written novels based in a historic time period, I wondered if we could start by going around, talking about what got you into writing from the historical perspective. You know, is there some initial spark or something that is in your personal story that kind of led you to write about history? Why root your work in real events that happened? So going alphabetically, let's start with you, Carol.
Well, I think history teaches us a lot, and there's a way to sort of delve into the past to really make sense of our present. And in Vera, I'm a East Coast transplant, and the '06 earthquake always fascinated me. And I think living out on this coast, you're always somewhat on the edge waiting for the next one. But it was also a time of great political corruption, and that nexus of sort of, society collapsing within a minute and all this overlay of political corruption seemed like an inherently dramatic template to base a story on.
Yeah, and Michelle, what about you?
So similar to what Carol said, you can learn a lot from what is in history, and you see a lot of the same patterns, which is both interesting and can be a little alarming at times. And it's funny, all of my books have a dual timeline of a historical component and a modern day component. So I do like drawing those parallels. And I never was really that interested in history until, because I grew up here in San Diego, and it's not a history rich area necessarily. It's pretty slim, just in terms of at least what they teach us in schools here. So I went to school in Virginia and really fell in love with history in colonial Williamsburg. And there's just so many little pockets of intrigue and interesting things, especially the lesser explored areas. And again, as Carol mentioned, a lot of lessons to learn today.
Absolutely. What about you, Kate?
I really think it all comes back to the fact that my mother was a librarian and had a degree in ancient and medieval history. So as a kid, not only was I growing up running around libraries nonstop and, reading and being read to, but I was hearing stories of the past as, bedtime stories. I was getting Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon and, Alexander and Gordian Knot rather than Three Little Pigs and Cinderella. So if you're growing up mainlining I, Claudius instead of the Disney Channel, you're naturally going to be gravitating toward the past when it turns out that you want to write your own stories. So mine really always started there. And even though I have hopped all over history as far as, what my passions are, I've never really felt all that tempted to write something in the present. I have always been more interested in the past. Maybe that's a little bit of escapism.
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting that you maybe could have become a historian, or done something in the academic or something that would put you in those history books versus kind of writing your own world through them. So did you feel that connection as a young person to did you get those seeds of ideas and spin-offs and sort of fan fiction of history? What was that? How'd you have that initial kind of attachment to personally write through those stories?
I don't think I want to be a historian because it sounds like too much homework.
Yeah.
It's a story. Being a storyteller is when you're looking at something saying, I could write a story about that. I could tell a story about that. It's not where you feel the urge necessarily so much to educate about that. Although I have nothing but respect for historians and educators, because honestly, I think the two feed each other because, nonfiction feeds fiction and vice versa. I mean, if the people who read nonfiction then become interested enough to look up fictional stories about it, the opposite is true as well. People who read historical novels, hopefully go down a Google rabbit hole and want to know what really happened and, start looking up the nonfiction about the same events. And then that's how the two can feed each other. I mean, I think the best example of that might be that, Lin-Manuel Miranda reads Ron Chernow's Hamilton and writes a musical about it. And then that leads to people who see the musical are reading Ron Chernow's Hamilton. The whole thing comes full circle.
That's so true, Kate. I mean, there's that aspect of research that is so fun. I mean, I think in all of us, there's that Curious George aspect of wanting to dive deep. But you want to research just enough to be dangerous, just enough to spark story. But the thing about sort of the news of the day, it tells you who, what, where, and when. And of course, story is the how and the why. Why did people do what they did in a moment in story? And that's the aspect of the storyteller and the novelist that goes beyond just what you might learn in history. But I think that's so true, Kate, what you said about them feeding each other. And I love when I hear my readers going back and Googling and
oh, that's the biggest compliment when they say, I spent hours Googling. You're like, okay, mission accomplished.
Yeah, it really is. Well, I actually wanted to ask you all about your research. And speaking of that, I did that with all 3 of your books. So
okay, good.
It all worked out.
Thank you.
I love doing that myself. But I did want to ask you about your research because as I was reading, I thought that must be one of the most fun things is to just, really soak up the surroundings and the people and all the things you can learn. And so I wanted to just go one by one at first, and then we can discuss this. But I wondered if there's an anecdote or a really special moment in your research or something that just stands out to you in the research that you did to put this book together, to kind of maybe share what that's like. How do you do it? And I thought maybe we'd start with you, Michelle, especially because it was something that you loved researching that led to your book. So.
Yeah, I mean, and all my books are kind of like that. The trick with research is, figuring out, and Carol alluded to this, because you can't just be telling this happened and then this happened and this happened. There has to be a story arc, a whole, tale told, not just a recitation of facts. But a lot of times you come across these interesting tidbits that you're like, how do I cram this into my novel? I know it doesn't, but like people should know this, and finding that balance is really tough. So usually what starts for me is I just usually read like a little tidbit about something. I mean, I've been interested. Nancy Mitford, the writer Nancy Mitford, is the star of my book, and I've loved the Mitfords. I've loved Nancy Mitford forever. Pursuit of Love has long been one of my favorite books. I love her voice. I love her blend of humor, and her just subversive nature. And her books feel very modern and fresh even now. But and her sisters, there were 6 sisters. They were all, for anyone that doesn't know them, they are the most interesting group of sisters. The mom used to say that whenever she would read, the father was a peer, he was a baron, and whenever she'd read in the newspaper, peer's daughter, ... she would just be like, okay, which one is it this time? One was a fascist, one was a communist, one was Hitler's confidant. Nancy was a novelist. She was a little bit more on the calmer side. One was a duchess. So they were always getting into these, problematic. If you've got very dramatic politics, you're going to get into some problems along the way. So I read a biography about the Mitfords called The Sisters, actually about almost 20 years ago. I think it came out in 2001. And I was just like, okay, at some point I need to write about somehow, this is before I was a published author. I was a writer for fun. But so I picked Nancy Mitford's time working in a bookshop during World War II. But it was kind of that overall sisters that inspired me, and just my general love of Nancy Mitford. But I am trying to get a little bit better about, and this is something Carol said, enough to be dangerous. I tend to sometimes over-research at the beginning. So now I'm trying to do less research at the beginning and more later down the road, enough to be dangerous, as Carol said, and then fill in the gaps later, because I do tend to get a little mired in it all.
Yeah, how about you, Carol? Was there anything, and you live in the town that your book is centered around. So what was the research process like for you?
It was a long burn, because as I said, I started collecting books on the 2006 earthquake, not intending, I never thought I'd write a novel based on it. This is my second novel set in San Francisco. So clearly my adopted town has caught my fancy. It's an intrinsically dramatic, both geographically and just historically. It's a dramatic place. It's a place with a lot of both peaks and valleys, literally and historically, but also with such a sense of folly, both shadow and light. So, but what I was thinking when Michelle was talking is, there is that fine line of over researching. So you get so crammed in your head with factoids, but I think we all read differently. We're reading for story. So we're reading for those pockets of things that we can exploit in fiction. I read newspapers from the time. I look at a lot of photographs. At the 2006 quake, there's just an incredible treasure trove of photographs. And a photograph can tell you all kinds of things, and it can both suggest what was true, and it can suggest where you can go in terms of fiction. But, like just a little detail, I came across, and there were firsthand accounts of survivors of the quake. And all of this, I really wanted to talk about, it wasn't just the quake. The mayor, Eugene Schmitz, was a crook, and he was going to be indicted the morning of the quake. And instead, he got a quake. And, he was a violinist and a pretty boy, and really it was put in the mayoral seat because he was susceptible to graft. And he kind of rose to the occasion for a period of time. Isn't that amazing about human nature? I mean, he assembled his enemies and his friends and started to rebuild the city. Yes, he was sentenced to San Quentin a year later, but for a year he kind of did his job. And in all of that, there is such room in disaster for reinvention and for social norms to shift. And I think we've just seen that in the last year. And I finished the book before the pandemic. But, it's strange to write historical novels where you're writing about a time in a different time, but you're read in an entirely different time from when you were doing the writing. And that's been really true in this book. So it's all context of, I would never have been able to predict that that the quake of 1906 would have this kind of relevance to coming out of this last year. It's just a different story.
Yeah, it was interesting actually that you say that the relevance. I did write my book during the pandemic. I
wondered about
right
that
at the beginning, and it was kind of interesting because as you're reading these accounts of people staying in London and living during the Blitz, you saw some parallel. Like at a certain point, people are just kind of like, this is how we're living right now, and they're taking their gas masks every time they went out. I mean, of course, that was much more. There were bombs falling, but still, it's that thing of like. You sometimes you look around and you're like, this is actually really horrible. And you're a little bit, you get kind of used to it. And then sometimes you step back and I was, and everything's kind of, your world shrinks and what you can do shrinks. And I did find the ability to kind of get in their shoes a little bit and be like, I can understand how that would like, just, you're kind of going about your day, but there's this overhang of like, things are not normal. Like let me go to work, but then there's bombs falling and here's your gas mask. So it is kind of interesting that how things you wouldn't think would be parallel are.
Right.
Yeah, I think Kate's book also really covers that nicely because there are some moments where they're out dancing, and they're in terrible danger, but they just I think one of the characters says something like, well, we can either die dancing or die out in the streets or something like that.
Yeah.
Kate, do you want to talk about that a little? And also I want to hear about your research as well.
Well, it's, definitely something that I think it's a human condition, and it's something that we react to tragedy quite often to think, or during times of, emergency, we think, all right, well, something bad could happen, but it probably won't happen to me, right? And I think especially when people are younger, they're apt to think that. And I know this because when I read war diaries, you kind of tend to think things like, why are you people driving into London, which is getting bombed every night, just to go dancing? But that's because there seemed to be this idea of like, well, we're really bored and we're 20 and we've spent all week working like night shifts, and if we don't dance it off, we're going to go crazy. And the odds are pretty good the bombs are just going to hit somebody else anyway. I mean, like everybody seemed to have this thought of like, it never occurred to us even once that we might get hit by a bomb. Right. And, I think it's like, all right, I look at lockdown and, I would see things like people partying on beaches and think, wow, well, I can't exactly say I haven't seen the same sort of attitude in, past. So these things happen, and that's all there is to it. And you can definitely find those parallels. For the research, there definitely is, the going too far stage. And I really do try to make sure that I don't go too deep down that rabbit hole. I felt with Bletchley Park, there was so much to research, not just about the code breaking process, the code breaking machines, daily life in Bletchley Park, the shift schedules, the life on the home front, the ration laws, the fashion. There was so much that I think I honestly could have been reading forever. And this is sometimes where your agent or your husband or your editor needs to like put a hand in and like grab you back of the neck and pull you out of the rabbit hole and say, I know this is really fascinating and there are another 300 books to read, but you also have a deadline. And so sometimes an intervention is called for. With this particular book, the research really was ongoing for really almost a 4-year process, from when I first had the idea till when I finally handed the final draft in. But I will say, one of those nuggets that surprised me out of nowhere was that history handed me some absolutely beautiful royal connections to Bletchley Park, which was great. And one of the ones that surprised me was the fact that the former Kate Middleton / current Duchess of Cambridge's grandmother was a Bletchley Park codebreaker. Shocking, but fabulous. So, yes, she does make a cameo appearance in the book. And the even more interesting thing that I found was that during the years when Princess Elizabeth was only about 13 years old and nobody was thinking yet about who she would get married to, a certain Prince Philip of Greece happened to be, as a young British naval lieutenant, he had a very serious girlfriend during the war who was a Bletchley Park translator. And that was so fascinating to me, this man who we now know, we think of as like, one of the world's, longest and most, perhaps most interesting marriages to, the sovereign of British Empire. He did have this romantic life before her, and including one very serious girlfriend during the war. And so I couldn't resist leaving that out. So there is an exploration of what that relationship could have been and what that would have been like. So that was one of those things I really would not have dared to make up, just throw a bunch of royals into the book because it'll sell better. But it's like history gave it to me on a silver platter, and I just thought I can't leave it out.
Yeah, I think that really is an example of the truth being stranger than fiction, because I when I read that, I was like, there's no way. And then it was just so fun to follow that storyline from there on out.
Well, I think if there's anything most of us can agree on, and I bet Carol and Michelle will back me up here, is that almost any time you read something in a historical novel that seems too wackadoo, it's right. That's the part that's real. And that's because we would not dare make it up. We would feel like we would be crucified on Twitter if we dared make something that's really crazy. So the really crazy stuff you read in a historical novel is more than likely the stuff that really happened.
That's true. That's very true.
That's great. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, that makes more and more sense than now that you say it. And again, that goes back to the fun of Googling all these things and going down the rabbit holes. I wanted to ask you a few questions just to dive deeper into the individual books. Starting with Michelle, I really liked how you jumped back and forth from present day to back in history. I'm even more intrigued knowing you wrote it during the pandemic. It felt, it's coming out next month, but it felt incredibly timely. Like, it could have been any of us who were friends with this main character. Why did you decide to do that? And also, how do you keep all of that intertwined and organized? And it just weaves together so nicely. But how do you do that?
Well, if anyone has a good idea about how to organize that, let me know. I'm still trying. That's my 5th book. I'm still trying to figure out the best organization. And there were very many times, there was a certain point during that book where I had colored index cards all over my wall, like taped up. So the modern day character, she's a writer and she's frustrated and they want her to write and there's a lot of my own writerly angst that was going into that character. And I had been working on a book about the West, the Old West, and everyone's like, you can't write about the Old West. You need to do World War II, and I'm like, fine, I'll write you a World War II book, and I'll do this, and and so we sold that book on a proposal, and it was kind of like almost tongue in cheek, like, okay, here's a writer, and she's being told to write about World War II, and so it's kind of it was a little bit meta, and that way it was I worked a lot of my frustrations out that I was going through at the time. Of course, they asked me to dial it back. They're like, can you make her not so angry? I'm like, okay, that's right. But a lot of my writer friends, including Kate and some other people who read advanced copies, were like, oh, yes, I'm familiar with, that kind of. So that part was kind of fun to explore, that sort of the publishing side. And so to keep it all straight, again, it was really at a certain point I was going to go in reverse chronological order, because you're trying to get this. It's a very compact period in Nancy Mitford's life, the historical character. It's only a few years, but she lived a very long time and did a lot of very interesting things. And so that kind of balance is very tough. And a lot of times that book, I overwrote it. It was, and then I probably slashed 30,000 words. So for me, that seems to be my process, like, is how it turns out, is I kind of do too much. And then I get a little help from my agent and my editor, where should I cut this? Where can I cut this to make it more streamlined? So
I'm glad I'm not the only one who does this.
Yeah. I know you get
massively overwrite and you have to cut thousands of words. I hate it, but I do it.
And you had to do a lot more than me. I remember but you made me feel better about it, because then you're like, okay, well, it's easier than having to add those words in, right? Later, it's better to pare back. So that tends to be my process. And again, I'm always trying to better organize and remember. Sometimes it's hard to remember the plot threads, but you also want to make them match up. So that's where my index. That one was harder than my other books for some reason, about matching the plot points and getting it all to line up. I don't know why. So that's where those cards came in that I had, because I had one online, and then I'm like, okay, I need to see this visually and where I'm going. So even at this point, I'm working on my 6th right now. It's still a bit of, trial and error. And then, you try to listen to podcasts with authors you like. You're like, ooh, maybe they have the secret that's going to solve all my problems. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, why? What was the decision? Was it just your personal angst spilling out into Nancy's story that kind of made you decide to do both? Because you could have just completely written the world around Nancy, but it's so cool how you have 2 women's lives intertwined. What was the decision there?
I mean, I like, I do like having I like having more than one narrator, however that ends up, whether it's, all historical or a combination. And I mean, like I said, I love Nancy Mitford, and I didn't really know that she had worked in this bookshop during the war. So that was intriguing to me when I was like, okay, I'll write my World War II, and then as I dug deeper, it was interesting because she was also struggling at that point. She was a published author, and her 5th book, which is kind of ironic now that I think about it, because it's my 5th book too, but her 5th book was what made her a hit, and that came out at the end of the war. But she had books before that, and she wasn't, that well. She wasn't that well known. The books, they did fine, but nothing that she wrote them to make money, which is kind of funny, because like that's not really why anyone should write. To make money, but different time. And so it was interesting because she had her frustrations were a little different too, but she had very urgent needs, because even though her father was a peer, they didn't have the money, he was horrible with finances, and a lot of those families, they have their land, but they have no cash. So it was just an interesting parallel of, and of course, Nancy is dealing with some more severe things because there's a war going on, whereas the modern day character is just kind of more dealing with her own personal drama. But Nancy has plenty of her own personal drama as well. They both have relationship drama. So I'd always wanted to write about Nancy Mitford or the Mitfords in some fashion. And it was it is easier sometimes if you're writing about a true historical character, and all my books are about a real person, a real situation, if you can narrow in on a very specific time period where it's not just like their life. But, she only worked at that bookshop for a few years during the war. And it's just an interesting setting, because a lot of books that are set in World War II, not a lot of them take place in London during that time period. I mean, some do, of course, and I've read them, but it's just a different aspect of it, and trying to imagine what it must have been like to live. When I first came up with the idea, it was just, we're talking February, right before the pandemic. So, what would it be like to like live in this, limbo, this, and you're looking at like, oh, sometimes the kids were going to school, and, I'm dealing with my kids not being in school, and like, wait, they were going to school during the Blitz, all of that kind of stuff. So it did make it interesting to explore as I started writing more of it. And, we sold that book at the end of March 2021, on a proposal. So, I really did write it during that chunk of that pandemic. I mean, we're still in it, but, the biggest part. So it was interesting to kind of like, these kids were doing this, and then you're sending your kids away to be safer, and that whole thing. And like, what if I was sending my kids away to be safer? And it did help in a lot of ways for me to I could put myself there. And also it helped that, I had to write it pretty quickly, and we didn't have anything else going on.
Yeah, and I know I drew my own connections by having a modern twist on it, thinking about what it would be like if I was, in the modern hunt for this mystery and this quest, and thinking about if I was back in the original time. So I want to keep this conversation about characters going, because first of all, I love that all of these 3 books have complex women in them. Very important to show, women in all their different capacities and life stories. Carol, I find it pretty interesting as someone who tries to elevate young voices in journalism, and as someone who thinks we have a lot to learn from the young people around us, that you chose to use a young teenage girl as the main character in your story. I mean, there's all these adults, as you mentioned, the corrupt mayor, and you could have told it from any perspective. So why choose a young girl, a teenage girl, almost a woman?
Yeah, well, I think 15, you're on the cusp of womanhood, and I wanted to write about a character. I wanted to write an adventure story featuring a girl, a young woman, because we have lots of adventure stories featuring young men. But also, Vera is particularly contrary in a time when women were expected to be a certain way. And there's the character of Vera, but there is the much older, really the very old, 100-plus-year-old narrator who is Vera looking back on this moment in time. And one of the things, it was both a challenge and really fun to write both voices and have the narration flow in and out of the character's point of view, but also, how would a very old woman look back on that pivotal moment in her life? And being of a contrary nature, she's inherently impatient, but she's really impatient and doesn't have a lot of time for filler, being the age that she ends up being. So it gave me a kind of propulsion in the book to tell it in that sort, with that sort of directness, and that was really fun to do. But I also wanted to show the complexity of what is it. So Vera is the daughter of the most successful madam in San Francisco. But instead of, and her mother is not just a successful madam, she's a major power broker. So Vera has access to the mayor. She has access. She can go to the places where most people can't go. And even if she's not allowed to go there, she goes there anyway, because she's just that kind of person. And when all hell breaks loose, there is no structure. So you can go and be with whomever you choose. But she's been put with a foster mom who's the antithesis of her mother, and who has her own troubles, who's in debt. And it's Vera's task to not just get to when the disaster strikes, and it's not just a quake, but it's 3 days of fire that burns 500 city blocks, 28,000 buildings, 250,000 people are homeless. It wasn't, so many people just think it was the quake, but it was actually the fire that just reduced the city to ashes. But she's somebody who's looking for home. She's housed, but really without family at the beginning, and she's unloved. And so in the process of this quake, of this devastation, she finds out who her real people are. And they're fellow misfits. And it's that sort of mix of right, wrong, who can you really count on in a disaster? One of the things that I thought a lot about in writing the book, and certainly in the last year, what would you do? What would you do if you woke up and it wasn't dawn, so your house is dark? How would you get out? Who would you take with you? What would you take with you? All those mistakes that get made. And, as Michelle, you and Kate have been talking, I've been thinking, the thing about historical fiction is our cars go faster, the clothes change, but like nobody's retooled human nature. And one of the great things about writing historical fiction is just the ways that, all the mistakes we make, all the sort of wrong rightness that is human folly. And particularly in moments of extreme, it comes forward. And so that's a long way of saying why I wanted to write about her. And I wanted to write about how she begins a certain way, and through crisis and through having to have all these people depend on her, she matures and she changes and really discovers not just who she can count on, but what she can count on inside herself. And that was interesting to sort of see that evolve, because you have one sense of what you're writing in a character, and then I don't know if you guys experience this, but like at a certain point, they do something, they become so real that they change. They go left when you want them to go right, and you have to follow them. So
at a very inconvenient moment.
In a very inconvenient moment.
Interesting.
It's like it blows your outline or whatever, Michelle, to your point, like the chaos of being in a draft, and like, that's not what I planned. And you gotta like retool, you gotta reimagine, but that's also the fun. I love when characters sort of go off script.
Sideways.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That it makes it feel like the characters are as real to you all as they feel as you're reading it. Like they're part of your lives.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, speaking of that, Kate, I actually want to hang out with the characters in your book. I wish I was in their book club. Especially my favorite, is it Queen Mabe or Queen Mab?
Mab.
Queen Mab, my fave. Yep. Can you talk a little bit about building your characters? And I was curious, how much are they closely tied to real women from Bletchley Park? How much are they kind of built from people around you or your own feelings? They're such great characters. I, again, want to spend time with them. So how did you kind of put their stories together?
Well, I have 3 very different women who are the narrators of the Rose Code. And I knew from the beginning that I wanted to have this book show Bletchley Park itself as almost like a 4th character, because the whole park is, so much of a personality in its own right, really. And I wanted the reader to be able to walk away from the book with a knowledge of how it is that the park works. How is it that masses of coded intelligence move into the park gates and then basically like almost go in this conveyor belt around the various stations in the park and then exit those gates as decrypted, translated intelligence that's ready to be used in the field. And then the more I researched, the more I realized if I want the reader to understand that, I'm going to need multiple narrators, because no one person or very, very few people understood every single thing that was happening at the park and had that bird's eye view that could tell you how everything was happening. And that's because the secrecy was so intense for working there that it wasn't even just if you worked in Hut 6, you didn't know what they did in Hut 8. It was more like if you worked in Hut 6, Room A, you didn't know what people in Room B did right next door. You were supposed to keep your eyes front and center on exactly what you worked on and nothing else. So that made me realize I would need different women working at different points in the park if I wanted to give the reader any kind of bird's eye view. So I settled on 3. It honestly could have been 4, 5, 6. Then this book would have been about 3,000 pages long. But I
would have read all 3,000.
And I knew that, for the 3 main stations of work at the park, I would have one of the women who was, a top level cryptanalyst. That's the people who are, wedging a foot in the door of the code and doing that critical original thinking that is just, prying it open just enough so the machines can get it the rest of the way. And then I would have a woman who was a decoder who's working on those very famous code breaking machines, the big bomb machines with the drums that go round and round like you see in The Imitation Game. And then you'd have a woman who was a translator, because all that intelligence, once it was decrypted, comes out in German or Italian. So then it has to be translated so it can be used. So that gave me my 3 jobs. And then it was a question of matching, okay, what kind of woman would be best suited to each job?
Oh.
And I knew too that I really wanted to show a real range of women as far as social class, educational status, family status, romantic status, almost everything, because one of the things I really admired about Bletchley Park was what a wide variety of people worked there. You really could have, a duke's daughter and a shop girl working side by side at the same job, and it did not matter who your father was, because you were at the same job, you're on the same shift, you just have to get the work done. So I love the idea that this would be throwing together women who had a chance to be friends who would normally have never have even met if they had not been recruited to work here. So that gave me, all right, I want a big range. So therefore, my girl who became the translator she's actually based very closely on a real person. Her name is, in my book, is Osla Kendall. The real woman was named Osla Benning. She is the aforementioned Prince Philip's wartime girlfriend. I stuck very closely to the broad strokes of her biography. My Osla is a Canadian-born debutante, who curtsied to the king, beautiful finishing school German, so many of these Debs did. And, she knew everybody in London. She was beautiful. She was effervescent. She was a prankster. And she's recruited to Bletchley Park with this real burning desire to prove herself, as more than just a pretty face and, a closet full of pretty dresses. So she's recruited there because of her connections and also because she has this lovely German. And that's how she comes to Bletchley Park. And she is based very much on one real person. Mab, my Queen Mab, as she is nicknamed, she is very much at the other end of the spectrum, not privileged, barely educated. She's from London's East End, a poor family. She's bound and determined to try to raise herself in the world, not just for herself, but for her little sister. She's doing that with a library card and a lot of ferocious self-improvement. And her idea, when she gets recruited to Bletchley Park just simply because she was tops in a typist course, is simply that she's going to do her part for the war, and she's going to look for a husband who's actually a gentleman, and because she thinks that's the way up the ladder. And so that's how she comes to the park. And she works on the famous decoding machines, and she's really more a representation of the women who were mini worker bees at the park, who were not necessarily recruited because of code breaking ability or language skills, but simply because you needed women who were detail oriented and smart, who could just do this kind of very close, attentive work and do it well. And then finally, I have Beth, who is my top level cryptanalyst, who has that kind of ginormous brain that can see patterns where the rest of us just see swirls of letters. And she starts out as sort of in the middle. She's a middle-class girl in the local village, not much in the way of education. She's already being seen as a spinster, at the age of 24. She has nothing in her life ahead of her except for being the spinster girl at home and looking after her parents until she dies. But being recruited to Bletchley Park, which really just happens because she's a local girl, it widens her world, and she realizes she has a tremendous talent, that she has a gift that she never really realized was useful for anything better than doing a crossword puzzle in about 10 minutes flat. But she can see patterns where other people can't, and she becomes one of the star code breakers of Bletchley Park. And I based her achievements on two, as a composite of 2 very real women at Bletchley. One of them was named Mavis Lever. She was one of the star cryptanalysts there, a university girl who just had an unbelievable brain and, achieved great things despite the fact that she was, young and just recruited to work in this place and had this opportunity at an unusual time. And then the other woman I based her on was the fact that there was a nameless woman from Bletchley Park who I read about, who was consigned to a mental institution, an asylum of some variety, after supposedly a love affair went south, and she had this emotional break. And British intelligence was so worried that she might disclose classified information in her broken state that she was clapped into an institution to basically get herself put back together. I don't know what became of her after that. I don't know what her name is. I don't know if she got out. I hope she did. Mental institutions were not necessarily good places. But as soon as I read that, I thought, well, that is an example of how seriously they took the possibility of any leak of Bletchley's secrets. And that is absolutely something that could have been abused. So that is another facet of what happens to Beth, and but not perhaps how she finishes up. So these are my three ladies. That's how they're all different, and it's how they all evolved from their particular jobs. And I gave them a book club to bond because they were so different at the beginning. I thought, what are these ladies going to have to talk about? And I thought, books, because
Yes.
book lovers can always talk books, even if they have nothing else in common, which is why this book ended up revolving also around a book club.
That's a great point. And it's interesting. There's some connections between the three of your books, actually. There's a Rose character in Carol's book.
Mhm.
There's actually Kate Quinn is mentioned in Michelle's book. Very mind-blowing moment for me. So thank you all so much. I hope that everybody wants to hang out with Vera, and we didn't talk about Tan, but a very interesting character.
Yes.
Queen Mab, Beth, and Asla, and Nancy. Such interesting stories. Thanks for sharing about them with us. If you all want to hold up your books, we're going to make sure to tell everybody where they can get them. Thank you again for joining me. You can purchase their books from Indie Bookseller Partners at bookshop.org/shop/SDFOB. Thanks for holding those up. Yes, please support our indie book partners. We also want to ask you to please consider supporting the great work at the San Diego Council on Literacy. You can go to literacysandiego.org. We have a full program of author panels, exciting demonstrations, and live entertainment streaming throughout the festival, so we hope you'll stick with us. All these videos will be available on sdfestivalofbooks.com. Thanks again to the authors for joining me, and to our viewers for joining as well.
Thank you, Abby.
Thanks, Abby.
Thank you so much. It's been such fun talking with everybody.
It's been great talking to all of you.